Good evening and welcome to our webinar, Filling Your Cup, Self-Compassion While Parenting Your Child or Teen with Tourette Syndrome. My name is Tanya Thomas and I am the Director of Programs at the Tourette Association of America. I will be your moderator this evening. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During the webinar, we would be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You may ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to mention that funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening's webinar, Dr. Kenneth Phelps. Dr. Phelps is an associate professor of clinical neuropsychiatry, an adjunct associate professor of clinical pediatric neurology at the University of South Carolina School of Medicine. Dr. Phelps also directs outpatient child and adolescent psychiatry services and co-directs the Tic and Tourette Center of South Carolina within the Prisma Health Midlands system. Dr. Phelps specializes in the treatment of youth to young adults living with Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, or anxiety disorders. He serves as a national supervisor and speaker for the Tourette Association of America's Behavioral Therapy Institute, educating providers on the delivery of comprehensive behavioral intervention for tics, that is CBIT. Dr. Phelps has presented locally and nationally on the systemic implications of illness and disability, as well as how to build resilience in the face of adversity. And finally, Dr. Phelps has been published in the Journal of Contemporary Family Therapy, the Journal of Intellectual and Development Disabilities, Social Indicators Research, Academic Psychiatry, and Families, Systems, and Health. Without further ado, Dr. Phelps, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you for those of us who are joining us tonight, whether you're watching this talk live or plan on reviewing it later. I'm so grateful and thankful that you took some time out of your likely very busy day to be here and talk a little bit about parenting, and specifically about how we can be compassionate and kind to ourselves as we traverse this extremely challenging journey of parenthood. Let's start with a check-in. So if you could see my office, what you would see is on the wall behind me, I have this large feelings chart. And frequently in the practice of psychotherapy, when people come in, we are working with them to help identify core emotions and feelings that come up. And we know that for many individuals, this can be a very challenging thing to do. Even there's a name for it. Alexithymia is individuals who really struggle to identify what feelings are showing up for them at any given moment. But the research tells us that most of us really struggle to identify the feelings that we're having, can name a few, but cannot name an array that you see here on the slide. And Dan Siegel, who's a professor of psychiatry at UCLA, often says, you have to name it to tame it as a first step. And as parents, that couldn't be anything but the truth, in that we are riding lots and lots of waves in our journey as parents. And some of the words over you see to the left are some of the most common words that I hear of parents of children who have tics or Tourette syndrome. Frequently, people feel very overwhelmed. They feel as if the resources that they have are not adequate enough to deal with all the things that are coming in their direction. I think frequently, when you have a child, we live in this space of worry. We are often living in a future of what if, Once heard it described as when you have a child, it's like a piece of your heart is walking around outside of your body. And it feels like such a vulnerable experience in our day-to-day lives. I don't think you have been a parent if you haven't felt frustrated and disrespected, if you haven't had moments where you feel criticized or you heard the words coming out of your mouth and said, oh, I'm sounding so critical. And then, you know, the last one I have on this left side over here is inadequate. And someone pointed out to me that this feelings chart of all the different feelings on here, the one that reoccurs is the word inadequate. And I think there is, you know, so much truth to that, because often the most common story I hear people telling themselves is the not good enough story. And I think one of the main places that that story shows up for us is we are not good enough or adequate as a parent, and we feel like we're at a loss in what we're doing. And I think it's part of just the human experience, and kids throw us lots of curveballs that we do not expect are going to be headed our way. So I've done some research on looking at parents of children with neurodevelopmental disabilities and disorders, and have found that parents don't just have things like these stressors you see listed up here, but they also experience a variety of enrichment. So this could be things like feeling amused. Our children commonly and teenagers do a lot of funny things, feeling fulfilled in our journey as a parent. Of course, things we talk about like feeling loving and hopeful or optimistic for the future. And I think kids bring out of each of us a sense of playfulness. And certainly when our children overcome adversity, we feel a great deal of pride. And these things you see here on the left, things like distress, and on the right, things like enrichment and even growth, tend to at times function like a seesaw, where in one moment we may be in the left column and the next moment we may be in the right column. And at other times we can actually experiencing these emotions in a coexisting way. They're happening inside of us at the same time. So let's start with just what's happening, you know, in many of our families where a child or teenager is living with a tic disorder or something like Tourette syndrome. First, we know the person themselves who is dealing with tics is often struggling mightily with motor tics or vocal tics. And this, as we know, comes along with a lot of co-occurring conditions. This could be things like intrusive thoughts of OCD or impulsivity or distractibility of ADHD, or rage and frustration, and sadness and worry and rumination. You know, these are the struggles that are common to many of the young people and adults who are living with tics and Tourette syndrome. But we know that individuals with tics and Tourette's don't live in a vacuum. They're influenced by and influence the family system. And today that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about parents and caregivers and family members who are in a caretaking role and trying to support the young person. Or we could even talk today more broadly about a partner or a family member who's living with tics and Tourette's. You know, we find that when we think about parents or caregivers, that they articulate some of the following experiences. Some of the words you saw on the former slide: feeling overwhelmed, worried, and helpless. There's been a lot of work done. Brene Brown has done a great deal of work in looking at the differences between things like guilt and shame, where guilt is usually when we're describing we made a mistake with our behavior, or we have some regret around something we've done, where shame, when it shows up, often sounds critical, it often sounds labeling, it often sounds very cutting to the core, like I'm a failure, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable. And many people that I've seen have described it almost like a bully in their brain. There's a critic or a bully, and when they make a mistake, they're just really, really hard on themselves. And this is where I've never met a parent who at some point hasn't felt, and I would say frequent points, including myself, felt exasperated and either finds themselves having a very short fuse or withdrawing. And some of that is the demand of parenting and the additional demand of trying to support a young person who has a condition that is uncontrollable and really, really daunting for the whole family, but also because there's all these things going on as well for many of us. We're navigating other relationships with other family members, other partners. We're dealing with work stress, financial stress. our own personal health conditions, our own struggles with anxiety or OCD or substance use. There's a lot going on nationally and internationally that can be very preoccupying and upsetting to see news stories of everything going on in the world. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention things that have been happening in the last few years, the COVID-19 pandemic and the increasing awareness in recent decades of adverse childhood experiences. So first, I had to think to myself that I think a time or two ago, I did one of these was last spring, and I was focusing on reentry anxiety. And I remember when they asked me to do this talk on reentry anxiety last spring, I thought, well, I know people are going to have a lot of anxiety going back out into the world, but things seemed to be winding down some. But yet the chronicity of that stressor of COVID-19 really added an immense amount of difficulty to most parents' plate, and there was more on the plate than they could kind of manage within their days and weeks. And then I do want to mention a bit more about ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences are things that we have gone through in our own childhoods, which could be things like poverty, a parent themselves living with mental health concerns, intimate partner violence or domestic violence within a household. If we have had these experiences in our own childhoods, which we know a good number of parents have, then when we lean into that role of being a parent ourselves, it can be incredibly challenging to figure out how to stay calm and not be triggered when there's so much in the role of being a parent that can be triggering of all of our own stuff. So I recently saw this visual when I was preparing for the talk, and this was published in Time magazine in 2017. So it actually preceded the COVID-19 pandemic, but it was used to describe the rage flu. And the idea that anger and rage is often contagious. And I would say it's just as contagious as things like COVID-19, that it is very, very difficult when you are faced with a threat, someone yelling at you, someone getting upset with you, a stressor in front of your face, to not yourself find being overcome with some sort of frustration and rage. And this happens more often than not in families, is as we're all coming home feeling stressed and overwhelmed and tired. Sometimes that contagion can kind of happen in the family system, and all of us make mistakes, look back on our behavior, look back on our choices, and replay it and wish, gosh, I wish I would have done that differently in some way. And this talk could have gone lots of different ways. Early in my career, I would have probably given a talk on behavioral strategies and ideas for sort of helping your child meet expectations and organizational skills, all good, important things, tools for your parenting toolbox that hopefully you can walk back out there and use that can help your child meet some sort of expectation. But the longer and longer I've gone, the more I've realized that, that's all very good. And I still do that very often in my practice. But even when we have all the tools, even when we know what to do, we are going to make a lot of errors. We are going to look back and say, that was not the person I wanted to be in that moment. And this is because frequently as parents, we're trying to pour from an empty cup. We're feeling overwhelmed and stressed. And this cup represents our energy, our emotional tank, our reservoir of loving actions that we can kind of pull upon. And unfortunately, many of the parents I see are entering treatment with really low tanks. And in part, that might be because of the presence of tics and Tourette's in the family, but more frequently, it's because of just everything in life, all the stressors that exist in a person's life. And a big part of treatment, as we go back to the beginning, is naming it to tame it. So it's self-monitoring. It's knowing internally how full is your cup and how empty is your cup in any given moment as a parent. And I think most of us could jump on board with this idea of valuing and appreciating this value of compassion. I care about being a compassionate person. And as the quote says, we try to remember as much as we can in our day-to-day lives that a touch, a smile, a kind word, a listening ear, an honest compliment, the smallest thing can change the direction of someone's life. And many of us have been the recipient of that, where someone said something that so took us off guard that it really snapped us out of a really dark or difficult space. However, we don't always extend the same degree of compassion to ourselves. In fact, I hear very often from parents, I can do this for other people. I can be kind and compassionate and thoughtful to other people, but it's pretty different when it comes to me. I have a really hard time treating myself with dignity and respect. And that is what we're going to talk about here today. So what does this mean, self-compassion? Really, I like this quote a lot by Christopher Germer, who's one of the leading writers on this topic, who says, the most simplistic level, self-compassion, is simply giving the same kindness to ourselves that we would give to others. So if a friend called you and they had made a significant mistake in their mind in parenting and said, I don't know why I said this, or I don't know why I did this, and God, I said this critical thing, or I lost my temper, or I just have been, isolating to my room because it's like I can't even figure out how to go in there and rally any support to try to get them to do the homework or to get in the shower or to clean up their room. What would you say and how would you support that person? And this is used in lots of different treatments. Many of you may have heard of a type of treatment called cognitive behavioral therapy, which is different than CBIT we use for tics. This is CBT. And one of the core questions used sometimes in CBT is if you had a friend and someone you care deeply about in this type of situation, what might you say to them? Or what would you tell them to do in this sort of circumstance? We also see it used in other approaches like ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy, which is a kind of a newer version of CBT, where we at times ask people to sort of take the perspective of another person or think about their older and wiser self. As a 40-year-old, I think, what would my 50-year-old tell me to do now self, or my 60-year-old self tell me to do now? And this is all about getting some distance to be able to do these sorts of things, to be able to treat ourselves with kindness, supportiveness, loving actions, caring, friendliness, openness, or an accepting manner. And so any of these words can sort of stick to this. It's whatever sort of resonates with you most. But, I would tell you, when you think about treating yourself compassionately when you make mistakes, be very careful of striving. We have a tendency toward goals and striving and achievement culturally. Piaget, who was one of the leading psychologists many years ago, who developed some cognitive developmental theories, said he would go around and talk to families and parents about how kids go through these stages of development. And a frequent question he would get from families is, how do we move them through these stages faster, or how can we do it more effectively? As if we're trying to get through it in a very rapid manner to achieve and to strive. And we apply this to ourselves as well. Many people have tried meditation, and there's been some research looking at things like meditation to cope with our own level of stress. And the big thing that matters is, are we approaching the exercise of relaxation and breathing with the hopes of how to sit with our pain and sit with our difficult experiences and be there with all the stuff that shows up? Or are we participating in that action with hopes to eliminate the mental noise of being calm? And that intention matters greatly to the effectiveness of the exercise of things like meditation for people interested in that. The quote you see on the screen by Pema Chodron says, compassion isn't some kind of self-improvement project or ideal that we're trying to live up to. Having compassion starts with and ends with having compassion for all of our unwanted parts. We all have a variety of parts of ourselves, some we like and some we don't like, and many of those show up in both ways when we're parenting our child. It's about kind of approaching those imperfections. And it's kind of like the dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT, technique of radical acceptance. And this is a stance of accepting the reality as it is. It doesn't mean liking it. It doesn't mean wanting it to be that way, but it's the whole notion of kind of, we are where we are and this is where it is. And we have lots of chances as parents to kind of be with that reality. And when I think about radical acceptance, I was listening to Brene Brown, who you heard me mention earlier, who was talking about in her family, she likes to practice what's called radical uncoolness, which I love this phrase, meaning that she always wanted to convey to her kids that the world out there emphasizes so much fitting in, conformity in some way, being in a group in a certain manner, and kind of having to put on a mask of sorts to navigate the world. And radical uncoolness is like, in this house, this is a place where we can be goofy, we can be awkward, we can be silly. And she uses the example of, we can dance in the kitchen until we're out of breath and have a great time. And I think that's such what many of us, I think, want our homes to be about. We want our homes to be a safe place where we and our children can be themselves. And really, I like that this quote also includes the word imperfection, because some of the most meaningful moments that we will have as parents are not our greatest moments, but are often our moments of imperfection. When we have made a mistake, when we have had a rupture in the bond between us and our child, and we find a way to be vulnerable and approach that and repair what's happened, those are the moments I think that will stick with us, and those are the moments that we'll feel most proud of as parents. So there are a lot of obstacles to this that might be popping in your mind. One of the big ones is, I have a lot going on. I don't have time to be doing a whole big old self-care plan, to take care of myself as a parent. And I think as the beginning of the presentation, I talked about, we do have lots of things on our plate. And the nice thing is that how I talk about self-compassion today, I hope you see that this is about moments. This is not about hours upon hours. And it's the same way that your dentist might say, brush your teeth for a couple minutes in the morning and floss on a couple minutes in the evening. Similarly, this might apply to self-compassion. Practice is important, but it's about practicing in small, doable ways as things get thrown your way. People sometimes have these next two things pop in their mind when they think about parenting, a child or teenager, which is, taking time for myself and setting aside some time for self-compassion feels selfish. Or maybe you have your own wounds or trauma where you think, I don't deserve this. And these negative thoughts in our mind kind of sabotaging any self-care can frequently pop up. And we can kind of get stuck on this mental merry-go-round sometimes as well. And lastly, I would say, one thing I thought early on when I heard about self-compassion in graduate school was, this sounds very woo-woo. I tend to be probably like some of you, like goals and like structure and like a plan, and the idea of sort of being kind to oneself felt very, out of the box. And I think, Dan Harris, who many of you may recognize that name, is an ABC News correspondent who recently retired from that job and started the app and initiative called 10% Happier, is a big proponent of self-compassion, and talks a bit about how he thought it sounded very woo-woo when he first heard about it too. So if you're having that thought, I'd say, hang with me and recognize that practice sometimes makes the biggest difference here to see how it lives out in your day-to-day life. So if you're thinking, I don't know that this fits with my idea of being a parent, I think your alternatives would be, you could continue kind of being self-critical in some ways. I think that culturally there is a bit of a script around kind of being hard on yourself, and firm to yourself and your mind might help you change. And we know that our minds tend to have a negativity bias. We tend to be very attuned to our own mistakes and to mistakes around us, and to do things that are aversive, that we don't like there. And we tend to be quite attentive to that and focused on it. And one way this shows up is shoulding ourselves. I should have done this and I should have done that, and we should all over ourselves. And that can lead to a massive amount of guilt and shame. And I tend to think doesn't really give us the outcome that we want with our children. We tend to be critical in our heads. We're more likely to be critical outside in our day-to-day lives. The other alternative that I see, a lot of people falling into, and I'm certainly guilty of this at times, is we feel overwhelmed and we're having a hard day and we tend to turn to distraction, and one big way we do that is by pulling out our phones. And I wish we were always looking at things like this person's looking at, like a delicious snack or a nice coffee. But frequently what we're doing is we're passively scanning on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok. We're often looking through images of our friends or our friends of friends or of celebrities or influencers, posting pictures of what's going on in their lives. And I tend to think that this is not bad. I think we need to move out of thinking of things as good or bad, but ask ourselves the question, is it workable, and is it helping us be the type of parent that we want to be? Recently we took our couple of our kids to see The Lion King on Broadway, and I was trying to get everybody ready, and we had a time limit to get everybody out of the house. Come on, we have to sit down, let's take a picture real quick before we go. There was more yelling than I would like to admit to, and more insistence and hurriedness, and the more you hurried them, the slower they go, it seems like, and they don't want to wear the shoes you want to put them on, and they're, why do I have to wear this? And then we sat down and took a picture and then ran out the door. And if you would have just seen the picture, which is what was posted, people were smiling, and it looked like we were in a bit of an oasis of sorts, right? But there's a whole backstory that people don't see on things like social media. So while I think engagement with media can at times help us cope with our own stress as parents, I would say treat this with caution and recognize that what we're seeing as parents is a curated version of other parents' lives, where we're seeing really extremes. I think there has been a movement of not just showing the best moments, but often people will sometimes talk about their worst moments and chronicle those on social media. But the reality is most of us exist in the middle somewhere in our day-to-day lives, and the grind of the day-to-day stress of being a parent of a child with and or without Tourette's or tic disorders, I think is something we often don't see portrayed honestly on things like media. So let's break down in our last bit here a little bit more about some concrete ways self-compassion has been studied and found to be effective for a whole host of factors that lead to a better quality of life for ourselves and for our kids. And I'm going to try to give you some very, nuts and bolts ways you might be able to use this in your day-to-day lives, and things that I've found helpful, certainly personally in parenting my 3 kids. The first is I'm going to go back to that initial statement I made around naming it to tame it. Most of the time, at least for myself and most of the families that I work with, we sometimes don't even recognize that we're in reactive space and we're in a bad mental space in our parenting until we're already in it, because we get sucked into that kind of rage cycle or frustration cycle, and it's almost too little too late when we observe we're there. So the first big step of self-compassion is mindfulness, and all that means is like attunement to how you're feeling and noticing when your cup is empty. So literally just saying to yourself like, uh-oh, I'm stuck, or oh, I'm being hooked by that thing, or oh, I feel the frustration kind of taking me over, or I'm not in a great mental space right now. And this is where you can go back to that feelings wheel. I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm feeling disrespected, I'm feeling like my own history of trauma is being triggered, whatever it is that's happening. The first step is knowing it's occurring and naming it, so then we can do a couple other things with it. So after we know we're there, we recognize when we're stressed or struggling, and not in a judgmental way, but just a noticing, observing manner. The second step is really what you've heard me talk about a bit earlier, which is some self-kindness. And so, people do this in mental ways, but at times physical ways. So one of the physical ways people will sometimes do this is they will literally take one of their hands and place it over their heart, or fold their hands together and take a really slow, long breath from their diaphragm and make a statement to themselves that they would make to someone else in this kind of circumstance that they really love and care about. And usually these are not long and elaborate and detailed statements. when people we love and care about are in a hard spot, usually it's something like, this is really hard, and this is really challenging, or you have a whole lot on your plate. You know, day-to-day life can feel really daunting at times. Something to yourself that feels kind and acknowledges that this is super hard for us as parents. And the third part is probably one of my favorites, which is to realize that though we may be in the privacy of our own homes and we may find ourselves isolated at times, that really there are millions and millions and millions of people that are doing the same thing. And many of them might be doing it at that exact same moment. There are parents all around the world who are struggling to parent. And there are many parents who are in that exact same moment parenting a child who's living with tics. And so to remember that the struggle of having your child clean up their room, of putting away their things, of doing their homework, of not experimenting with things that are going to cause them great harm, and how to engage them in those hard conversations as teenagers or as young adults, or how to get them to get out of the car and get into the school, or to use the technique the psychologists or therapists had taught them. Like, that is a universal challenge for many, many, many parents. So the third step, after you acknowledge you're getting stuck, at times take a step away, put your hand on your heart, acknowledge where you're at, take some deep breaths. The last step is to say, I'm not alone in this, that there are millions of others who are dealing with the same thing right now. And what I hope this looks like is in many ways practicing the parental pause. You know, where we find ourselves frequently is this cycle you see to the left, where a young child throws their food on the floor, or refuses to eat, or pees their bed in the middle of the night, or continues to come to our bed, or a school-age child, you know, doesn't do their homework, or gets F's on their report card, or is hitting or screaming at their sibling, or a teenager who's sneaking out to be with a boyfriend or girlfriend, or is yelling or screaming or isolating to their room. There's some sort of stimulus, right? A stressful stimulus, coming and confessing intrusive thoughts, you know, tics that are really disruptive and loud, or to the family system and to the person. And often we react. We move very quickly. There's not even a moment in between, and we find ourselves reacting, and frequently we meet the affect of the person that we're engaging in. So if they go to a 3 out of 10, then we're going to a 3 out of 10. If they go to a 4 out of 10, we might go to a 5 out of 10. And then before we know it, we find ourselves a 9 or a 10 out of 10. So really what we mean when we talk about mindful parenting is practicing the pause and trying to fill that pause with a degree of self-compassion. So what that means is, when something shows up in front of you that pushes your buttons, is being able to take a breath and say, I'm feeling myself starting to get upset, or I don't want to lose my temper, or I don't want to get frustrated, and I'm trying to get better at taking a moment. And so I just need a few seconds to just kind of work through how I'm feeling, because I love you and care about you, and I don't want to get upset right now. And sometimes you don't say all of that. You just notice the thing unfolding in front of you, and you just, in that moment, take a breath. In that moment, step away. In that moment, you might need to tag team your partner or another family member to help you out. But it's just finding little tiny ways to pause and try not to be on autopilot. What you do after the pause, right, that's where all the other good behavioral skills can sometimes be helpful. But I operate under no delusion that that will always work and always be helpful. I think those are tools, right? And you need different tools for different situations, and there's not a one size fits all sort of thing. So another thing, if there are those of you who really like mindfulness practices and things like meditation, I would strongly encourage you to look into loving kindness meditation. This is, as long as I've been practicing meditation, been one of my favorite practices. And the nature of loving kindness meditation is you basically bring to mind someone you love and care about deeply, and extend to that person love and safety and health and peace, and really the hope that they live with ease, as much ease as they can. And you make those sort of statements to yourself over and over again, and then you bring to mind other people in your life and try to extend that to them. And at times people bring to mind themselves and try to extend to themselves safety and healthiness and peace and living a purposeful and as ease as we can to ourselves in our life. And then finally, sometimes people go to the degree of kind of extending that love and kindness to an enemy, or somebody that we have a really hard time being with. And it's just a practice of sort of checking in with yourself. And frequently for myself, if I'm headed home from work after a really long day, where I'd be more apt to walk through the door and be frustrating or not have my kids be as seen or as heard as I would want them to be, I think taking 2 minutes in the driveway to just slow down your breath, think about who you want to be in this next moment, and realize you're going to be hit with lots of triggers, and then trying to really extend mentally to the people you love and care, and all the positive vibes that you can sort of send their way, I think is what loving kindness is about. I also like this, this comes out of a book by Pollock, who writes a great deal about self-compassion for parents, and talks about, using kind eyes and filling your cup with kind eyes is how I put it here. And this is, comes from the idea of beginner's mind. A beginner's mind is, we frequently walk around all day long and we see things and we begin to sort of zone them out as not new or novel, and our mind is very attuned to the things that are new or novel. And so we see our kids day in and day out, so we sometimes miss the mindful moments. So a great way to do this is if you walk into your children's bedroom or teenager's bedroom or even young adult's bedroom when they're resting and when they've already fallen asleep. That's why I put the image up here. Unfortunately, these days they're often falling asleep doing schoolwork or with laptops or phones, but after they've fallen asleep, and you just sit on the bed and sit quietly, and just practice noticing, watch them breathe, coordinate your breath with their breath, try to look at them almost as if you've seen them for the first time, and like, can you notice anything different about them, anything you haven't noticed before? And, I did this the other day with my youngest and noticed, he had all these freckles that have popped up on his nose since he's been out in the sun, and we've been running around so much I didn't even notice, that these freckles were so apparent on his nose. And, think about what it must be like to be your child, what it must be like to be in your family, what it must be like to go through their day. And, for many of our young people who live with tics and Tourette, sometimes, not always, but sometimes sleep and bedtime is one of the few times their bodies get rest. And so just to be with them in that moment and to just notice them in ways you might not have noticed them before. Another way to do that is, frequently if I'm flying on an airplane, I'll look at pictures, old pictures, videos, these, what we might call sweet spots, sweet memories. Sometimes it's called sweet spots in a treatment called ACT, where we try to bring people back to these like core memories of just really wonderful moments where they felt really connected and at peace with their child. And why this is so important is that people don't walk around talking about this all the time, but within the consultation room, when people come and see me confidentially, it is not uncommon for parents to say, I am so frustrated with my child, and there's so many times I don't even like them. It's hard to be around them. And so to realize that we have to reconnect with that love and reconnect with that care, and realize that the connections that we build at 4 and at 8 and at 12 and at 14 and at 18 are going to look different. And we have to find ways to stay really connected to that attachment that we have with our children. I talk frequently about values because I think it's this just really valuable addition to what we do as therapists. And I think it's important when we think about what families are doing too, is that, I would encourage for you or anybody who's helping you parent to sit down and really think through what matters to us most as parents. There's so much that you could focus on. What of all the words you see really matters a lot to you, because that will influence what you focus on, what you talk about, the stories you share, what you want to model. And for some families that might be gratitude, for other families that might be creativity, for other families that might be, forgiveness. Certainly there's lots of moments in all of our lives where we can emphasize our persistence, or try to be acting from a place of courage. And I think that those are the kind of traits that we know are super important when people are dealing with anxiety and when families are trying to reduce accommodation and help the young person really face fears and do hard things. So I think I would be remiss not to at least mention this before we end the talk, as well as just the very practical things, right? The very practical things, some of which may take you a little bit more time than the moment of pause. And different things work for different people. I think you have to find something that works for you. One way to think through this is senses can be really important: sight and smell and taste and touch. So for some people, it needs to be something really physical, like weightlifting or running. For other people, like, they have to be outside, they have to be in nature, they have to be gardening, they have to be taking a hike. For others, it's the traditional kind of spa-like experience, so candles and a bath and a certain lotion, massage, treating their body with respect. Certainly, woman and man's best friend, pets who give us that unconditional love and usually are excited to see us at any times or emotionally supportive for us, as well as, rest is important. Sometimes it's taking a nap, it's enjoying good food, might be enjoying a good glass of wine, listening to music, spending time with friends and family, and then creativity ourselves, like painting, and certainly things like breathing and imagery. And even we're coming out of March Madness, and I work here at South Carolina, and the South Carolina Lady Gamecocks won the championship. So that was a bit of self-care for me, to be able to take time out of my day where I wouldn't typically do that and watch the basketball game with a couple of friends and really enjoying ourselves. So you got to figure out what fills your cup, and then as much as you can, try to purposely schedule this within your day and within your week, even though the thoughts might come that say, oh, I should really be prioritizing others right now. The old sentiment of you have to put the mask on yourself on the airplane before somebody else, I think really holds a great deal of truth. And if you can't muster it for that reason, I would say our kids and teenagers are watching us. They are actually watching you more than they are listening to what you're saying, probably a lot of the time. So what we teach them and the way we live our lives and the way we act, I think, matters deeply. And we are going to act in ways that we feel deeply guilty about. But how we recover from that and how we rebuild, I think, is so important. And that we do that with kindness and dignity and respect to ourselves is what I wanted to leave you with tonight. So if you're on live with us, or I think if you're watching this following, we ask that you just take a moment to scan this QR code, and there should be a survey that pops up that is asking you a little bit about this talk, a little bit about your experiences. And so we ask that you, if you can, to please do that. And I'm going to turn it back over to Tanya, and we have a few minutes for questions. If anybody has any questions, we'll ask you to type those in or communicate those to her, and then we'll finish up.
Yes, and thank you so much, Dr. Phelps. It was an excellent presentation. We are now going to begin answering some questions that have been, I'm looking to see if any questions were submitted during the presentation. Participants, as a reminder, you can still submit your questions through the question pane on your control panel. If we are unable to get to everyone's questions here at the TAA, we have a full-time information and referral staff member who can answer your questions via email at support@tourette.org or by phone by calling 1-888-4-TOURETTE. That's 1-888-4-TOURET. Okay, I'm going to look to see if we have any questions. And one question is, what does one do, what does a parent do when they're feeling absolutely overwhelmed and they've tried different things, they've gone to therapy, they've seen a number of people, and they just don't know what else to do next. And
Yeah.
their child is, unmanageable.
Yeah. I think the first thing I would say to that parent is that sounds incredibly difficult, and I think to have the ongoing persistence to continue reaching out, to continue seeking help, to continue asking professionals or people for support is incredibly difficult when you feel like attempts to reach out have not been necessarily super fruitful, in the past. I would say that I would do my best to encourage that person to be kind to themselves through all the hard moments and to continue trying to build any sense of community that they can for themselves, especially with other parents who might have some understanding of their struggle. I know when we speak specifically about tics and Tourette's and the co-occurring struggles, I think there have been times that the Tourette Association has some online support groups, and I think sitting with other parents who may have a very different story but can appreciate, I've been in that spot before too, is an incredibly powerful experience. I used to do some consultation and talking with groups of parents, and I think there is nothing that can replace the sitting with another parent who's been there on some level, and I think that holds sometimes way more value than talking to a therapist or talking to a professional. I sometimes tell people that if they're trying different things to help themselves cope, to really try to stick with something for at least 3 or 4 weeks and to try to sort of set up a plan of I'm going to try this out before they say, well, that doesn't seem to be working, and turn to another one. I think that frequently when we're in a place of desperation, we move from kind of strategy to strategy to strategy to strategy. And so sometimes kind of sticking with it a little bit with something can be a really hard part of the work, but can help us assess whether something was effective or ineffective. But without knowing a lot more details about that person's circumstances, I would just say, to do their best to stay with it and do that in a way to realize that that this is a really hard thing. It's a really hard thing.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how would you recommend a parent respond to a teen who is very self-critical and all or nothing with their mindset?
Yeah. So clinically here, I see a lot of young people who are, and parents really, who are perfectionistic, and that comes with sometimes very all or nothing thinking. And what that might look like is, the young person is saying things like, I always mess up and I never get picked and nothing ever works out, and I'll never do that. A lot of always, never, there's no room for gray kind of in the thinking. And I think that's a really painful thing for a parent to see a young person struggling with. And so what I see a lot of parents doing, and I've done myself, is that we try to counter that message. And so we try to give some sort of encouraging, positive message in response to that, though the child in this case is very much stuck in this spiral of negativity. And so then I think you end up almost polarizing one another, where you end up in this like court battle basically of like the negative and the positive, the negative and the positive, and the harder you try to validate, the more they refute it with negativity. And there's a model for that even in a treatment called CBT, where we think of it kind of like a Pac-Man. And if you have a negative belief inside yourself, you might be likely to kind of spit out any positive thing that comes your direction when people try to pay you compliments. So the first thing I'd start with is I'd want that a parent to really validate, like, you're having a really hard time right now. I can see you're really struggling. I can see you're in a lot of pain. I can see it feels like it's always this way, and I'm really sorry to hear that it feels totally that way, but I'm willing to be here with you. I'm willing to help in any way I can right now within reason. When you feel like talking about it, I'm gonna, for myself, just take a few minutes to compose myself, because I want to figure out how to best be there for you. But like trying to create space and then circling back around to that conversation later, because you may be able to say the positive or encouraging thing at another point, when they're not sort of in the spin of it all. Because when they're so activated, you're probably not going to be able to get that logical message through. You kind of have to wait until the logical mind is kind of back on, and the kind of emotional mind is settled down, a little bit.
Okay, thank you. Another question is it normal for a person to feel more anxious when they start a mindfulness meditation practice?
Yeah, I think that I hear that a lot. I think that when we think about mindfulness, I think the first thing that pops to many people's minds is like a sitting meditation, like sometimes what's called a formal practice of sitting on a cushion and breathing, and I think that is just not what works especially for a starting point for lots of people that I see. Is that I often encourage people instead to do something very minimal and manageable, like a minute or 2 minutes, or it may be something like going for a walk, or and observing things in nature, or it may be things like eating mindfully, slowing down between bites and just looking at their food and tasting a piece of chocolate. I think thinking out of the box would be, sometimes when people do something a little bit more active with their mindfulness, they do a little bit better than the like, I'm going to sit here and try to clear my mind, which is kind of a bit of a dangerous zone to be in, because really mindfulness is about showing up with all the stuff that comes in. And frequently as parents, we're running all through the day, and we have that brief period of time, sometimes right before bed. And if we do it in like a seated, formal way, sometimes when we first start to do that, we're kind of overwhelmed by the tsunami of internal material. And so I would probably integrate it in a little bit more during the day at first, and just start in a micro moment before, some people try to get an app like Calm or Headspace, and they try to start with, 10 minutes or 20 minutes. And sometimes that's a lot to bite off at the beginning, particularly when we don't have a lot of time, as parents as well.
That's great advice. And I saw, Dr. Phelps, I saw your picture before, but it disappeared. So I just want to let you know, if you want to click on that again. And let's see, we have another question here. What is your opinion on medications? Our family is not open to the idea of medication, but our neurologist often, and in parents always, recommends it. We support our son on his decision to not take meds, but want to have more than one opinion.
Yeah. Well, I think that what I would say is, here in our center, I co-lead that and work very closely with a pediatric neurologist. And I think that medication has a role, and I think medication can be incredibly helpful for some young people. And I think about it like, what is the level of impairment? And often I will recommend that someone meet with a neurologist or a psychiatrist if their level of impairment in their day-to-day function in their day-to-day lives is really in the severe range. So this is really causing great disruption to their lives, because I think there are pros and cons to medicating, and I also think there are pros and cons to not medicating. Typically, in a lot of cases where you may see more mild to moderate struggles, frequently I think that many of the tools we might use in psychotherapy can be effective, especially if the young person in the family is invested and wants to use those skills. And I think one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that often now, not in every state, but in a lot of states, you can access a person all around the state. As long as they're licensed in your state, they might be willing to see you in that state. And I think that sometimes certainly finding the right provider can be challenging. But I would say that the right medication with someone who goes low and slow and really is monitoring very closely what's happening and working with the other people on the treatment team, I've seen be remarkably successful. But I think, obviously if you're meeting with a therapist and psychologist, they're going to lean heavily on skills-based sorts of things and therapy-based interventions. If you're meeting with a neurologist, they have in their toolbox medications that we know hold some degree of efficacy. So that's going to usually be their recommendation. And I think as a parent, it's perfectly fine to say, let us write that down. Let us do some thinking about it. Can we call the nurse back and kind of say if we decide we want to start it? Could we schedule something in 2 months to kind of talk about it after we try some therapy? I think that's, you know, an understandable approach to particularly conditions like Tourette's and anxiety and OCD that tend to wax and wane for most young people and adults.
Okay, this is great. And one last question I see is, what should I do if I think others have it so much worse when I try to use self-compassion because this cues feelings of shame?
Yeah, I think that there's this phrase we sometimes use called comparative suffering, meaning that at times when we think about our pain, we contextualize it by feeling like we have to compare it to other people's pain. So I have it worse than them, or they have it worse than me. And I think it's human nature. It's the same thing that shows up when we're engaged in social media, where we find ourselves almost like creating this mental rank list of who's better and who's worse and who has it worse and who has it better. And I think it's just part of the nature of how we're wired is to do some of that. And so I think, you know, noticing and naming when that's happening and working to be in a place of saying, you know, most everyone has strength and struggle, you know, and though in this person's case, though my struggle may not be as bad as, you know, for instance, a family right now who has been displaced in Ukraine, or people who've suffered, you know, atrocities, you know, it's still pain, you know, and pain is pain, and pain should be acknowledged and should be appreciated, and, you know, in a really compassionate way. And so I think that that's something that the person may feel like they have to work through for many years. It's not something that changes overnight, but I think is an important thing to know when that's showing up, is that it's kind of part of that thought process of, I don't know if I deserve, you know, kindness or deserve compassion. And I think part of being a human and just the nature of being a human is, and a being really, is that we deserve compassion, and we deserve to see ourselves as worthy and respectful. And I think that's something a lot of us have to work through in day-to-day life. But thanks for the questions.
Yes, thank you everybody for registering your questions. And Dr. Phelps, thank you again for an excellent presentation. Everyone on this webinar, this is all the time we have at this point in time. Once the webinar is closed, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would greatly appreciate it if you would complete that and provide your feedback. You can also scan this QR code that you see on the screen, and you will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of the webinar. Additionally, the webinar will be posted on the TAA's YouTube channel for those who were unable to participate today. We encourage you to reach out to us about this webinar or other ideas and suggestions you may have. And on behalf of the Tourette Association of America, thank you again for joining us and for taking the time to view our presentation. And again, thank you, Dr. Phelps. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening, everybody.